Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I mean, you may be wondering why I'm one of the speakers in this conferences, but Sebastien already explained to you, because I wrote this piece that's published in Journal of Neurosurgery about the social turmoil we're all experiencing, while bringing the perspective of an immigrant Lebanese who has witnessed indeed the horrors of war, that almost anything else does not look as worrisome when you go through a war like we went through in Lebanon for so many years. But I also am a Lebanese who long ago realized, within an encounter that you will hear about that lasted only a few minutes, that the American spirit can soar much higher than the American eagle, our symbol. And we need that in these times. The piece I wrote appeared online in August and in print just this month. And of course, it caught Sebastian's eye, which is why I'm here today. And I hope, I know it will be a little bit of a change of pace for you this morning, but hopefully you'll get something out of it. So this is a piece that Sebastien talked about. You're of course welcome to read it. And I thank you and I congratulate you for putting together this fantastic conference. And I've made sure that medical students at University of Miami, my residents, and all my contacts know about this. So I'm sorry it's virtual, but I'm sure in future years it'll be in person again. So my disclosures are, I am not an activist. I have not spearheaded any social reforms. I don't have a specific agenda, yet safeguarding human rights is absolutely at the core of my beliefs and profession, and I'm sure yours as well. And I would say this is me at age 3 in Latakia, Syria. I think the photo with me holding my father's cigarette in hand will convince you of my—
Dr. Morcos, I'm so sorry. I apologize for cutting you off. I think your microphone is like rubbing up against something. So
I apologize.
Okay, perfect right now. Thank you so much.
Is that good? Yeah.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you.
Tell me if it comes back. Maybe it's the table at which I'm sitting.
No, right now it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, but please do interrupt me if you do it again. So you can see me holding my father's cigarette in hand there, and I think that's clearly an early commitment to my commitment to 2 fundamental human rights: the right of equal opportunity to all goods and the right of freedom to express oneself, even to pretend that you're smoking at that age. So in the coming 30 minutes, I will try to touch upon all these themes. Each one of them, of course, can take you hours, but I have 30 minutes and I'll just touch upon all of this a little bit. So let me start with May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis events involving George Floyd. So of course, Floyd was suffocated and could not breathe. The nation was outraged and could not comprehend. Besides the mass protest in our cities, various entities and institutions either genuinely or politically felt compelled to issue anti-racist statements. And this is actually what got me riled up. Of course, we're outraged, but these statements often sounded so sterile. Talk is simply cheap, blanket and abstract, hide really behind the veil of corporate communications. It's like just what people wanting to get, some people getting on the bandwagon. It sounded like empty political slogans from many sources, like designed to fool and capture votes. A vigorous, uninvited denial, as you know, not unlike the actions of a criminal not yet accused, may often give an unintentional admission of guilt. But most importantly, saying you are against something says nothing about what you are for. And this is why I actually sat down on June 6th and wrote the piece, trying to kind of bring my feelings into it, saying that this country had celebrated the best of times and anguished through the worst of times. And in today's social unrest sweeping the nation on the tail of this pandemic we're in, it will not go down in history as one of our finest hours unless all the channeled anger, frustration, and loss of life inspire and produce meaningful reform. But those reforms will not come to pass unless prejudice and racism are indeed crushed from within, one person at a time, and so forth. So I am a professor and co-chair in the department. I've been here 25 years. I was born in Latakia, Syria, of a Syrian father, Lebanese mother. I lived in Beirut through most of the war. I left at age 26 with my MD degree from AUB in 1985. I went to the UK because I could not come to this beautiful country, US, and spent 4 years beginning my training in neurosurgery, and then eventually made it to the US. I've been here 30 years. And yes, the Lebanese civil war indeed marked me, but it is a so-called Lebanese civil war because it certainly was not Lebanese, was not civil, and was not really a war, as you will see. In the best days, Lebanon is known for the marriage of modernity with tradition, as you can see here. Its coastline and its skiing mountains, its canyons and its valleys, its lakes and waterfalls, its rivers and its forests, its majestic cedar tree and its soaring mountains, the symbiotic existence of multiple religions, the hospitality and tolerance of its beautiful people. Yet Lebanon is absolutely neck deep and even further in sectarian culture and politics, an unstable amalgam of disparate religious and cultural influences, as you can see on the map there on your right. So under the influence of outside forces, internal conflict exploded on April 13. It was a Sunday, I remember it distinctly, 1975, I was 14. And the spark of the 15-year ordeal was the shooting of innocent civilians in this infamous bus. This sorry symbol, this bus, this sorry symbol of the war still stands today as really a dilapidated monument to human ignorance, insanity, and cruelty. Downtown Beirut was the scene of the most violent fighting. Let me play you this movie, gives you a little bit of an idea.
Beirut, once a jewel in the Mediterranean, but then torn apart by war. This is the seafront of the Lebanese capital today, around 3 decades after the end of the civil war. The devastating conflict lasted for 15 years. This street was the green line dividing Beirut into east and west. Dominating the front line was this concrete skeleton, what was once the Holiday Inn. Its walls still peppered by the scars of war, a grotesque witness to the years of separation, killing, and destruction.
It is actually ironic, but my father was the general manager of this very hotel, and the last day he worked there was the day the war started. This war was no ordinary war, as the conflict involved militia for the most part through street-to-street fighting, and later Syrian-Israeli armies in addition to multinational peacekeeping forces. Gives you a hint of what that looks like. That's how it was. I went to the American University of Beirut, a fantastic institution, now 154 years old. It was founded by US Presbyterian missionaries in 1866. This is a beautiful campus with a commanding view of the Mediterranean. The American University Hospital has been around since 1905 and seen its share of casualties during the war. You can see it there. And these are some statistics early on in the war in 75, 76. You can see 1,100 wounded per month were showing up in the ER of that hospital. You can imagine the horrors and the tragedies. By 1983, Ronald Reagan decided to send the US Marines as a peacekeeping force. I'd like to stress that. It was not to fight, but as a peacekeeping force. This was their headquarters, kind of nondescript civilian aviation building at the airport in Beirut. Of course, not every warring faction in Lebanon was thrilled with the US presence on Lebanese soil. And on October 23, 1983, 6:22 a.m., disaster struck. A suicide bomber drove in a truck full of explosive into the building. 241 of the 300 Marines occupying the building died in the blast. You can see a before and after picture. You can see the track that the truck took to achieve its deadly mission. And here is the TV announcement at the time.
Marines who lay sleeping in their bunks. Helicopters are working non-stop to ferry the wounded and dead to the fleet offshore. Dazed Marine officers say the massive explosion was caused by a truck carrying some 2,000 pounds of TNT. It crashed through the front gate, raced past shocked Marine guards, and exploded in the lobby of the building itself. Early this morning, the open area in front of the rubble was strewn with stretchers bearing the bodies and pieces of bodies of dozens of dead Americans.
Truck crashed right into the lobby of the four-story building on an apparent suicide mission, and when the explosives were detonated, the whole building just fell in upon itself. Many wounded. There are still said to be living men in there as we speak, with their fellow Marines working frantically to try to dig them out. There are undoubtedly more dead men in there, too. The death toll stands officially right now at more than...
The survivors the carnage was horrific. You can see pictures there. The survivors were taken to local hospitals, including AUH, where I was, and from there to the US carrier Iwo Jima, and from there to a military base in Germany. You can see the bottom right picture, the wounded Marines in Germany, having some of them arrived there for further treatment. Unbeknown to me at the time, which you will read about more in the piece, this gentleman, Pierre Sabah, was the first photographer on the scene. He later on married my neighbor and childhood friend, and I did not know till last year that he is actually responsible for most of the pictures I am showing you today. Many of the injured were brought into the AUH emergency room, which by now, 8 years into an endless war, was certainly no stranger to human horror. On that fateful Sunday, the sheer scope of that horror, however, was simply overwhelming. Even to the experienced physicians and nurses, bodies of the injured and dead spilled outside the small ER that I showed you earlier and were laid down in endless rows on the pavements and streets around the hospital. Every available physician, surgeon, resident, medical student, and nurse came to help triage the injured. This was me that year, fooling around there with my buddies. I must be exactly the age most of you listening in today. And I was on campus that day. I had not yet visited the US, nor come face to face with its legendary military. Like many young Lebanese with big dreams, I knew America through the biased lens of its exported movies, its rock bands, and the handful of brave US college professors who taught us at AUB in wartime. But a remarkable, although very brief encounter was about to take place that day. right there. You see where the asterisk is on the bottom left. This is outside the emergency room. This is a modern picture, of course. There was no divider on that street back then. The wounded and dead were on this street, on the ground. The president assigned me in the hectic situation, the care of one of the Marines. I was in a very strange of mind. My dad had just died in this very emergency room 6 weeks before. So I approached this wounded Marine whose life I was suddenly put in charge of with enormous trepidation. He was shirtless, an impressive amalgam of muscle, grit and composure. He was riddled with rocks and shrapnel, and I was riddled with fear. He deserved a real doctor, and all he got was me. I simply could not let him die. I hope you can put yourself in my shoes as a medical student, and I'm sure you face this every day. So I kneeled next to him, visibly shaken. He was conscious, bleeding actively from his left temple, and probably from other places that I could not see. He was incredibly serene. I glanced for advice at my overburdened chief resident. He was working feverishly a few bodies away. He told me just put pressure on the wound. I did, of course, with an ungloved and probably very hesitant hand, and I held tight. That's all I did. Now, maybe it was the way I looked, my tremor, perhaps he sensed the recent loss of my father, my sadness, my incompetence. But clearly, I will never forget that moment. This man, injured from head to toe, a stranger in my land, was hated and targeted by others, just looked at me and smiled. This Marine, injured, smiled at me and said, "Don't worry, doc, you will be fine." So this was the patient comforting the physician, the injured soothing the healthy, and so forth. Very ironic, embarrassing, and yet uplifting all at once. So, you know, the Lone Rangers and cowboys, the warriors, the crime fighters, the leading men and comedians, the physicians and scientists, that American movies that were watched by Lebanese teenagers like me, that movies chosen by American directors and producers to represent American culture, those people looked more like me. Sunlight reflected readily off their skin. In other words, they were white. But his skin happened to be blessed with enough pigment to help it absorb rather than reflect most of the sunlight that shines on it. On that day, this man, this unforgettable teacher who left an indelible impression on me, a young Lebanese man, was absolutely the best ambassador who could have represented the essence and destiny of the US to the rest of the world. He was a courageous, dignified American citizen, an American Marine, a Black American Marine, and thank God he was indeed. You see, the movies, if you rank the best actors of the 1970s and 80s, here they are, here are their pictures. You have to go down to number 32 or number 34 to see a Black face at the time. Even then, Richard Pryor may have been and remains to this day the most remarkable and talented comedian. Sidney Poitier, of course, with his class, remains one of the most inspiring and classy actors of all time, yet neither of them really played so-called heroic roles that a teenager would want to emulate. They were incredible in their own way. So after this encounter, I really never knew the fate of this Marine. To this day, I don't know. I never knew his name. I don't know if he lived or died. When on May 25th, I saw George Floyd on TV on the ground in Minneapolis with an oppressive white man kneeling on him, stopping airflow in his trachea, rather than a sympathetic white man like me kneeling next to a black man stopping blood flow from his left temple. In a strange way and a very anti-parallel fashion, I was reminded of October 23, 1983. What are we to do as a society to combat chronic insidious racism? Silence is unacceptable. Words are better, certainly, but ineffectual. Actions are better yet. But I would say what I put in my piece, an even better response than that would be for our so-called leaders to rise to the occasion, inspire a desire and empower an ability to identify, educate, and reform young American minds well before prejudice sets in and manifests in their brains. And then, and only then, perhaps we would be worthy of savoring and applying the words of the inimitable Maya Angelou when she said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." So my article appeared online on August 7, 2020, an incredible coincidence 3 days before August 4th, 2020, this cataclysmic event happened yet again in Lebanon to rock the very foundations of that country, my poor country of Lebanon, already decimated by corruption, mass protest, economic collapse, COVID-19, and a brain drain of very talented physicians that have left it. A string of despicable, corrupt, incompetent government officials allowed the storage of unimaginable quantities of flammable ammonium nitrate in the middle of the city in the port of Beirut for 7 years. And this is what happened. The city was all but destroyed. The house I grew up in with my 88-year-old mother in it still is about 2/3 of a mile from this blast. This is the third most powerful man-made explosion in history. This is the after picture. So Sébastien wanted me to tell you a little bit about what's going on currently in Lebanon. So here is a little bit of a broad brush stroke of what's going on. I'm indebted to Human Rights Watch, the Lebanese chapter, for some of the information. And my former classmate from high school, this man, Fouad Rahmi, who's actually president of Lebanese Business Association, in French, it's RDCL, for giving me some of the data. This is COVID-19 today. Their alarming surge, lockdown in effect, insurance plans, health insurance plans don't cover it. 85% of Lebanese hospitals are private and not subsidized by the government for COVID cases. You can see the numbers to date, 110,000 positive cases, mind you, a population of 6.8 million. Economy, poverty, 55% today are below poverty line. This is twice as much as 2019. Extreme poverty, 23%. Cost of food up by 300%. Currency, the Lebanese pound, was devalued by 500%. What is needed, and many things are needed, but certainly a government-initiated direct aid program. There was an international aid pledge of 300 million from 36 countries, but that aid is contingent on serious governmental reforms. So it's a very circular argument and situation to be in. The blast that I showed you left 212 dead, 6,000 injured, 300,000 without shelter. The port handles 70% of food imports, and now it's destroyed. $4 billion in damages. There is lack of functioning of social safety net for basic rights, created dependence on a corrupt, sectarian-based spoil system for access to basic services, jobs, education, healthcare. It's only really the local civil society groups and volunteers that are filling in for the outrageous absence of government. Corruption is in all ranks. 98% of Lebanese believe the problem to be very large or large. There has been very little accountability for public officials. There is a loss of $2 billion per year in customs revenue due to that corruption. Women's rights, I mean, maybe people, you know, it's not surfacing because so many other things are going on, but look at this. Ongoing discrimination of women, 15 distinct religion-based personal status laws discriminate against women. Inequality in access to divorce, child custody, and inheritance property rights. Unlike men, Lebanese women cannot pass on their nationality to foreign husbands and children. Marriage is still allowed in 2020 in some religions of a woman less than age 15, a girl, not a woman. Marital rape is not criminalized. Protests, of course, many other wars I can tell you about, undue force by security forces. Freedom of speech is punished if you're critical of government or religious institutions. There are 1.5 million Syrian refugees. 3/4 of them are non-resident. There are 200,000 Palestinian refugees. The migrant workers are excluded from labor law protection. They are subjected to exploitation and abuse. Environmental and health, solid waste management laws are ignored, and so on and so forth. And of course, the political influence of outside countries go on the chessboard that has become Lebanon. So I now would like really to conclude by taking you back to my Marine of 1983. I have been searching feverishly for whom he might be, where I could find him. I discovered in my search that the surviving Marines of 1983 in Beirut formed a group. This is it, Beirut Veterans of America. You can go to their website. They wanted to ensure that October 23, 1983 will never be forgotten. Last month marked, of course, the 37th anniversary of the tragedy. The group produces very nice memorabilia. This is, you can see, beautiful fusion of the Lebanese flag and the American, the Lebanese cedar and the American flag to commemorate the sacrifice of those who simply came in peace. And this is a beautiful memorial that exists at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, not Florida, Jacksonville, North Carolina. Members of the BVA meet there every year on October 23. I was actually hoping to go there last month, but of course I wanted to find my Marine. But because of COVID, it was a virtual meeting like this one. I wanted to ask them, do they know of a Black Marine with a scar on his left temple? He would be in his late 50s, early 60s. But I will find him. I'll keep looking. Did he survive? Or is he ill? Is he a patient in the VA system today? Did the US healthcare institutions fail him because of the color of his skin and in spite of the content of his character? I need him to be alive today. You understand that. I need to thank him for making me fall in love with his land and his people. I need to show him how, because of him, I knew that the US was indeed the right place for me. Because of him, I learned to value much more that quiet stoicism that patients show me and show you and will keep showing you in your careers every day. Please learn that kindness is free to give and yet paid back manyfold in return. I learned that patients do not choose their illnesses, that all patients deserve our time and our empathy. And I learned that those special patients who carry their burden with inspiring dignity and courage absolutely deserve our deepest respect and admiration. And again, going back to Maya Angelou, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. So but what I really want to tell him, most of all, is that because of him and many like him, I and all of you should carry today enormous hope in your hearts that even after 4 decades have passed, many Americans still harbor today in 2020 the same values that this man possessed 40 years ago, not the least of which are decency of character, nobility of purpose. Because of them, I think we stand a chance of rising above the social turmoil that is absolutely tearing us apart today. So I will find him and I will walk with him and I will read to him verses of my favorite author, Gibran Khalil Gibran, under American sunlight, one of us reflecting that sunlight, one of us absorbing that sunlight. And we will both say in unison what Gibran said many years ago: do not be merciful, but be just, for mercy is bestowed upon the guilty criminal, while justice is all that an innocent man requires. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morcos, for sharing this incredible story. While you were sharing this, I was getting so many messages from people just remarking on just how incredible it was to hear you to share this. So we can take a couple of questions just for a few more minutes until maybe 11:58. So if anybody has any questions, you can speak up now, and then we can take a break until 12:15, where we have Dr. Deborah Ottenheimer here, who will be doing a session on COVID-19 and gender-based violence around the world and women's reproductive health around the world. At the same time, there'll be a session going on climate change and human rights. And remember, both will be recorded, so at a later point, people can watch if they wanted to watch both. And we'll also have PHR doing some asylum discussion. So if anybody has any questions for Dr. Morcos, you can speak up now. A lot of thank yous in the chat, but maybe no questions. People might be just sort of still recovering from how incredible that story was. I remember reading it for the first time in the Journal of Neurosurgery and just being completely blown away. Honestly, I was speechless, but I'll extend again if anybody has any questions.
Sure. Hi, my name is Rebecca. Lebanon has a very close place in my heart, as you know, our neighbor as an Israeli. And so I wanted to ask you, how you see the role of medical students in, humanitarian conflict, especially because a lot of the emotions you conveyed in your piece about, treating someone and saying, oh my gosh, I'm the doctor for this person in war, and that not being really fair to them is something that I've definitely experienced and definitely thought about more than once. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you see the role of medical trainees in those kind of situations and what advice you would give for people in similar situations.
You mean in war situations, you mean, rather than... Yeah. You learn a lot, you learn quickly. I mean, supervision is key, of course, when it's mayhem, chaos rules in, and you do what you can. You see the dead around you. I mean, I remember being in that ER with militia people coming to gun us down unless we save their family member versus the opposing family member who was wounded. That's chaos. You cannot control chaos. But I think the power that medical students have is, of course, their enthusiasm, perhaps not a full slate of knowledge yet, but that's where guidance comes in. So maybe set up, what was done in many war situations, kind of a pyramidal system. You delegate, smaller and smaller portions to that student. The reason I was sent to this Marine, the chief resident realized probably he was not severely injured. And yes, Morcos can go and put a finger on his, bleeding artery, and that was big enough task for me at the time. But I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I would say.
Thank you, Rebecca, for asking that question, and thank you, Dr. Morcos. We have another question in the chat from Tom. Tom, I can invite you to just say your question out loud if you'd like. If not, we can read it for you. It's totally up to you.
Yeah, this question from the UK. Just wonderful and inspiring presentation. Thank you so much. And my question is, have you ever had a similar encounter with Jewish patients or healthcare staff in America, which has led you to reframe your perspective on the value of kindness and human dignity, bearing in mind what happened in Lebanon in 1982?
Absolutely. I'm in Miami. I have many Jewish patients, and this is what upsets me about these artificial separations that exist between nationalities, religions, and I talk with my Jewish patients a lot about the war days in Lebanon, and I've been to Lebanon and so forth. I get invited all the time to give neurosurgical talks in various places. Absolutely, you realize when you talk, when you're outside mayhem, you realize how much more alike people are than they're different. But I'm not telling you anything that any of you doesn't know in this conference. And we just need to focus on what is common, not what separates us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Morcos, for joining us, for giving us your time, for sharing this incredible story. I can't tell you how many messages I've been receiving just about how touching your story has been. So thank you. And I think now we should give everybody a break. It's been a long morning. So we'll give a break until 12:15. So everybody go ahead and maybe have some food or anything, relax a little bit, and please join us again in 15 minutes. We'll have Dr. Ottenheimer to talk about COVID-19 and gender-based violence around the world. And we'll also have a session on climate change and human rights. So please join us at 12:15. We'll regroup here.
Thanks
again,
again,
Dr. Morcos.